again, thanks for joining me today. There's so many things that are going on today that are a cause for worry, fear, and anxiety. In Portland, the riots have been continuing for over 50 days, and it looks like a war zone over there. The mayor has not called on the police to stop the riots. There is a continuing fear of catching the plague, the coronavirus. There are the economic difficulties as a result of the quarantine. There are health concerns. There are monetary concerns, financial concerns, health concerns. There's so many things that would cause fear and panic in people today. And some of the political experts say that all of these things are political strategies to take over and change our system of government. Well, that may be so, but I would just like to encourage all of you today, especially those of you who are believers, that we have a God who is in control. Now, the Bible was written to encourage us when times like this happen. That's why very, very difficult and challenging times happened to many of the Bible characters. In fact, some of the situations are a lot more difficult than what we are experiencing today. What is the safest place on earth? Where will you find that? Where is the safest place? Well, in the book of Esther, we learn 4 reasons to find that safest place. And the safest place is to be living for God, to be in a right relationship with God. Why? Because our God is omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, eternal, perfect, and righteous. There is no force in this world that can overcome God. And God has a plan. Now, life in this world basically has always been a battle between good and evil. Good being God, evil being Satan. It almost reminds me of a chess game. I don't want to trivialize this, but I use the example of a chess game because it requires a lot of strategy, a lot of thinking. The opponent makes a step, but before he makes the step, he tries to plan several steps in advance to get to the goal, which is to get rid of the king, right? The head. And the same thing happens for his opponent. He tries to foresee the steps that his opponent is making. And one of the things that help tremendously a person who plays chess is a photographic memory, so that he can remember all of the steps he's previously planned, or remember the steps that his opponent might be planning against him, so that he can overcome this. Well, you know what? We've got a God who has a perfect photographic memory. Nothing can escape him. He is omniscient. There is no plan or scheme that can be hid against God. He knows it. He is omnipresent. We cannot hide anything from God. He is omnipotent. There is no power that can prevent God from enacting His will. In fact, He could even control our thoughts. He could influence our thoughts. And so just to think about the qualities of God makes me want to be on His side, right? You want to be on the side of the most powerful being in this world. And although Satan might be powerful and he might be threatening, we need to understand this. His powers are limited. His knowledge is limited. In fact, he already knows his end. He already knows that he is condemned to everlasting judgment. And so he's trying his best while he has the time to confuse and deceive as many people who are created in the image of God to hate God. So when you are on the side of God, you are the enemy of Satan. And so I want to encourage you today to know this, that when you are on the side of God, you are in the safest place in the world. Reading the book of Esther, I have come up with 4 principles or reasons as to why living for God is the safest place in the world. And I'm probably going to divide this into 4 segments. Each segment is going to deal with each of these principles. And the first principle is this: the safest place in the world is to live for God because God foresees the future and orchestrates events to his advantage. Now, when you read the first chapter of the book of Esther, the first character that's presented to us is King Ahasuerus. King Ahasuerus is so successful. He's got, I think it says he's got over 120 provinces, call them states, that he is controlling, and he is basking in his glory, in his victory, and he gives a party. He celebrates, calls his officials and his leaders, and he just shows them the grandeur of his reign. 7 days after the 180 days of celebration, he gives a party to all those in the citadel of Susa. And at the end of that, well, he is just filled with merriment and intoxicated. He asks for the presence of his beautiful wife, Queen Vashti. He wanted to present her to his guests. But you know what Queen Vashti does? She rejects the king's offer. She doesn't want to comply, and she stays in her place, doesn't show up. And so it becomes an insult to the king. And so the king gathers his advisors and asks for their advice, and the advisors tell him, this is a very dishonorable thing that the queen has done. If you allow this to go unpunished, and I'm saying this in my own words, if you allow this to go unpunished, then all the wives in your kingdom will dishonor their husbands. So you must do something about Queen Vashti. And basically the advice was to divorce her and to find a replacement for Queen Vashti. So let me read to you what it says here in Esther chapter 1 verse 12. So in Esther 1, 17 to 20, Queen Vashti is removed from her role as queen and replaced by a more beautiful and respected queen. For this deed of the queen will be known to all the women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands, as they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she did not come. So this is the advice, and we skip to verse 19. If it pleases the king, let a royal edict go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of Persia and Media, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti cannot come before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to her neighbor who is better than she. And let the king's decree that he will make be proclaimed in all his kingdom, because it is vast, and all the women will honor their husbands, great and small. Now, when you think about the insolence and rebelliousness of Queen Vashti, we wonder what made her do this. Why does she think that doing this in this kind of culture that is run by a very powerful king would somehow let her escape the consequences of her insolence. We don't know exactly what she was thinking, but her act is not something that was unknown by God. God, in fact, uses the removal of the queen in order to introduce Queen Esther, so that Queen Esther will be raised into a position of influence. Why is that? Because there is going to come a man who is going to be the enemy of the people of God, the Jews. Now back then, when you were called a Jew, you were basically associated with people who worshipped Jehovah, as opposed to a multitude of gods that the pagans believed in. Kind of like today, to be a Christian was to be a believer of the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one of God, God himself, the God of the Bible. So that was what the term Jew meant. And so let's think about the influence that Esther was going to have when she was going to be raised into that position of influence. Now, I'd like us to apply that into our lives right now. Right? As Christians, God has called us not simply to be happy that we have been called from darkness, but to understand that to be a Christian is to be an instrument of godly influence in a dark and broken world. Right? So wherever we are to be instruments of godliness. We are to be instruments of light. We are to be salt that preserves the righteousness of God in this world. Now, I'd like to share with you a video that talks about the wonderful, wonderful influence of a Christian student. Will really inspire you as you live your life as an influence for godliness wherever you are.
To Dr. Richard Lumsden, former professor of biology at Tulane University and Medical School, and the former dean of the graduate school, evolution was science, whereas creation was merely religion, and he taught as much to his students.
What I would try to get across is that science is science. Science deals with the real world, with real phenomena. We don't bring into such discussions inferences of supernatural.
Dr. Lumsden, who studied at Tulane, Harvard, and Rice, couldn't believe it when the Louisiana State Legislature passed a law that if evolution were taught in the public school classroom, then equal time had to be made for creation science.
My reaction to that was just total consternation. Who are these people telling us, PhD level scientists, how to teach and what to teach regarding science? So I just thought the whole thing was just absolutely absurd. But it was not the energy of a supernatural nature. I was prompted at that point to give a lecture on the origin of life, giving creation its due with as much mockery as I could summon. Truly, in the beginning was the Word, but the Word was hydrogen.
After that class, one of his graduate students came up to him and said,
"Great lecture, Doc." Well, that got my attention. Flattery always did. And she said, "But I have some questions." And indeed she did. She had a legal pad, and I could see line after line after line after line.
So they had an appointment, which ended up lasting longer than anticipated. The appointment also ended up changing Dr. Lumsden's life.
Now, I'm not trying to challenge anything. I just want to get my science straight.
That's fair enough.
Okay.
That's fair enough.
Last month, you taught how mutations were genetic disasters. How by natural selection can they randomly produce new and better structures?
That's a good question. Good question. I'll probably have to think more about that.
Okay, well, aren't the odds of the random assembly of genes mathematically impossible?
You've had your share of mathematics. Let's see if we can't figure that out. Not only were we talking about a mathematical impossibility, we were talking about a physical and chemical impossibility, which gave me pause. Genes, that might be 10 to the 200th, 10 to the... Those are pretty formidable odds, aren't they? Mm-hmm. But the fact remains is that we're here. And in reality, the only way we could have gotten here is through the evolutionary process. So the fact that we're here really proves evolution, doesn't it? And these are the events, molecular events, genetic events, that were mechanisms, part and parcel, of the evolutionary process. I could buffalo a student when I felt myself get a little bit in trouble, okay? I'd had a few years' experience at this, okay? It's a trade secret. But for the first time maybe in my life, in explaining various facets of evolution theory, I began to listen to what I was saying. And what I was saying wasn't making very good scientific sense.
Where exactly in the fossil record is the evidence for progressive evolution, the transitional forms between the major groups?
You know, most of them, come to think of it, are fully formed kinds in their own right. This conversation with the young lady went on for approximately 3 hours, during which time, again, we entertained these questions, and the whole time I'm answering, I'm listening to my own responses and trying not to betray this to the student. Was rapidly concluding that this is not making good scientific sense. What I'm telling this young lady and what I told the students this morning is not good science. And so far, I guess we just haven't been lucky enough to pick up the critical evidence. It dawned on me right then and there that evolution was bankrupt as a scientific theory. Well, if that were so, if life did not originate by a naturalistic, materialistic, spontaneous process, what was the alternative explanation? Oh my God. And I said it then, not in blasphemy, but in awe. What happened that afternoon was, first of all, a mortal embarrassment to me as a professor. Professing to be wise, the professor was made a fool. And then secondly, with the realization that, hey, God exists and God created, was that experience of fear. Now that's enough to turn a corner in anyone's life.
After much study and soul-searching, Dr. Lumsden became a creationist first and then a Christian.
One event led to the other, and the culmination was finding myself before saving altar, on my knees, at stiff neck, broken, in obedience, asking Jesus to come into my life, to be my Lord and personal Savior.
Today, Dr. Richard Lumsden, former evolutionary professor, is a committed creationist because of the scientific evidence. He has since openly debated evolutionists. He feels that in light of the great advances of science in the 20th century, evolution is no longer tenable.
The evidence of science, the best in paleontology, the best in biochemistry, the best in genetics, and so on, is all compelling for creation. Creation theory does not rest on some purely metaphysical principles. It rests on the same science that evolution theory would rest on, except that the better explanation is creation, not naturalistic, materialistic, stochastic, or random evolutionary process.
Now, I hope you were encouraged by that. So that ends our first segment of the safest place in the world. We are living in the safest place in the world when we live for God, because God foresees the future and orchestrates events to His advantage. I'll see you next time.